Welcome in, everyone. This is Sean with MTG 808 Jr., and today we're going to be taking a look at a blue-red control deck for standard Pauper. If you enjoy killing all of your opponent's creatures and watching them helplessly try to kill you while they have just run out of cards, then this is a deck for you. But before we jump into looking at blue-red control, just want to make sure that everyone knows about our upcoming Youth Championship Scholarship Tournament. This will be happening in early May here on the island of Oahu, and we're going to be offering $500 in college scholarship to first place and $250 in scholarship to second place. So, hope that all of you youth standard Pauper enthusiasts out there are preparing to play in our big tournament. The format is standard Pauper, which is what we're going to be looking at today, so you're in the right place. So this is blue-red control. This was a deck this is my version of a deck that was given to me by Michael Ulip. He is the advisor of the August Aarons Elementary School Magic Club. One of his students played a deck very similar to this, I think of Mike's design, at our previous standard Pauper deck, previous standard Pauper youth tournament. And I think they went 2-2, I believe. So not bad, especially considering it was this player's first tournament ever. But wanted to feature the deck today because I love me a good control deck. Anyone who knows me well knows that blue is my favorite color to play in Magic. When I did very well at the Junior Nationals many years ago, it was with a mono blue control deck, lots of counterspells, big giant creatures to finish the game. And this deck takes after my own heart. So if you want to look more closely at this text version of the deck, there will be a link to this in the description. But for now, we're going to jump over here to Magic Online and take a look at the visual version of the deck. And before I jump into talking too much about this particular deck, I want to highlight that it's a very similar deck to the blue-black control deck that we featured a couple videos ago. Where is that? Blue-black desert control. Here we go. So a little bit of a tangent here. One of the players, Tegan, one of the youth players from Kavaihona, played in our recent standard Pauper tournament, and she built this deck based on our video on blue-black control. We'll have a link to that video, that deck tech, in the description. And she had all the pieces except for Opt, and she didn't have Ops because it's actually really hard to get people to donate Ops. Most of the cards that I'm providing these clubs with are donated by the stores, but Opt is like at least $1 common, maybe even more. So she was like, I don't have Ops, I can't really buy them. Oh, gotta reset filters. I don't know what to do, and I said, well, if you don't want to play Opt, or if you can't play Opt, then this is probably the next best card. I actually didn't even think about this card when I was building this blue-black control deck, but she played 4 Striped Riverwinders instead of Opt, and it ended up being very, very good for her. Yeah, and they serve similar functions in the sense that, if you need to dig for cards early, maybe you're light on lands, you can cycle it, right? Very often Opt goes digging for lands if you're short on lands, right? You don't get the Scry, but you can still cycle it to dig deeper into your deck. And then later in the game, if you have 7 mana, it's just a big giant threat. Hexproof is really hard for standard Pauper decks to answer, and it's a 5/5, so it's just huge. Sometimes Opt, when you play it in the later game, you're kind of hoping to draw into one of your threats, right? So Striped Riverwinder, not as flexible as Opt, but definitely more powerful than Opt. So she was playing 4 Striped Riverwinder, and basically just the rest of this deck. And, I think she came in 5th or 6th place. So she was almost into top 4 with this build, just with 4 Striped Riverwinders instead. But if you were to replace these, right, if you were to just cover up the Ops and play Striped Riverwinder, then there's a lot of overlap between this deck and blue-red. You're losing the black removal spells and trading them for red spells. But for the most part, the decks overlap a lot. Oh, we're lagging a little bit. Here we go. Okay, so just wanted to point that out. If you're a fan of the blue-black control deck, you may want to take a look at this blue-red control. Okay, so back to blue-red control. Already talked about Striped Riverwinder, how it's kind of like a nice split card. Very powerful in the late game, very flexible in the early game. Definitely what Control wants to be doing. This deck is not playing Soul of the Rapids in the main deck. Soul of the Rapids also has Hexproof. It's a great finisher. It has evasion, but it's definitely less durable. It doesn't block as well. Whereas Striped Riverwinder, you can tap out on 7 to play it, and it'll block as well as it's going to attack on the following turn. So, a little more powerful finisher here. And then the blue cards are pretty much the same. Hieroglyphic Illumination, also a very flexible card. We already talked about how good cycling is. If you just need to turn it into if you need to get through your deck more quickly in the early game, maybe you're strapped on lands, maybe you're spending your mana doing other things, you can pay 1 to cycle it, very cheap cost to draw a card. And then in the late game, it's always a 2-for-1. If you're able to pay for this, you're going to draw 2 cards, you're getting your 2-for-1, right? That's the game plan of this deck. You want to kill all your opponent's stuff and then end up with more cards in your hand after them. So, Hieroglyphic Illumination, very much one of the cornerstones of this deck. The fact that it's an instant is very, very relevant because this deck is playing a ton of counterspells, alright? And counterspells, you're playing 4 Essence Scatter and 3 Cancel. Cancel counters any spell. Essence Scatter only counters creature spells but costs 1 less. These are very, very powerful cards. Excuse me. I'm still fighting off the end of this cough/cold. So counterspells are very powerful because you're paying only 2 mana, and you might be countering a creature that costs 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 mana, right? Same with cancel. You're spending 3 mana, you might be countering something that costs way more. So you might get a huge tempo advantage when you are casting these spells. But the catch is that you have to have the mana open as your opponent is casting that creature, right? You can only counter a spell when it's being cast, when it's on the stack. So, if you're playing a bunch of counter spells and you want to maximize their use, you want to play a deck that's full of instants. So this is what we call a draw-go archetype, where you have a deck full of instants. Your ideal game plan is to just draw a card, or untap your lands, draw a card, play a land, and say go. You might play a cheap spell, right, that you have to play at sorcery speed, but for the most part, especially in the early to mid game, you want to be leaving your counter spells up. If your opponent plays something very swingy or very powerful, and you're able to just say no, right, eventually, if you do that enough times, you're going to run them out of cards, and then Striped Riverwinder can come in to close out the game. So you want to be leaving your mana open to make the most use of these counterspells, and that's why Hieroglyphic Illumination is so good, because let's say you play your 4th land, you leave up cancel, right? Your opponent plays a creature, and that creature's, you're not that worried about it. Maybe it's a pretty weak creature. Sometimes if a smart opponent is playing against counterspells, they won't play their strongest creatures first, because they want you to use your counterspells on their weaker creatures. And so Hieroglyphic Illumination, if they play something you don't want to counter it, you can hold the cancel in your hand for future turns and then still get use out of your mana by paying 4 to draw 2 cards with Hieroglyphic Illumination, right? So having this at instant speed allows the deck to play a great counterspell game plan. So Hieroglyphic Illumination, can't speak highly enough of this card in the control archetype. Alright, so moving on, I'm going to continue looking at the instants, and then we're going to look at the sorceries. So we've got a bunch of red removal here. I'm just going to talk about Opt real quickly since we already kind of touched on it. I'm only playing 2 because I wanted to find room for more Striped Riverwinders. And as I said before, I think Striped Riverwinder is the more powerful card, while Opt is the more flexible card. You do want flexibility in a control deck because there's a saying in Magic, there's no wrong threats, but there are wrong answers. And what we mean by that is that any creature with power can win a game on an empty board, right? But if your opponent's creature has, hexproof, then you're going to need to have a counterspell to answer it, right? You can't answer it with a removal spell. If your opponent's creature has 3 toughness, you can't answer it with shock, right? If your opponent's creature, if they snuck it in on a turn when you were tapped out, then you can't essence scatter it, right? So your excuse me, your answers are much narrower than the threats that your opponent is going to be throwing at you. If you build a good control deck, you're going to have an array of answers, but finding the right answer at the right time is very important, which is why we want to play some number of opt to kind of give us card selection. It's not card advantage in the way that hieroglyphic illumination is, right? You're spending 1 card to get 2 cards back. Opt, you're spending 1 card to get 1 card back, so you're not getting an advantage in that way, but you are getting an advantage in terms of selection. You're not getting card advantage, you're getting selection advantage. So opt gives us a little bit of selection, helps kind of stitch together our amalgamation of answers to whatever threats our opponents throw at us. So that's opt. Lightning Strike and Shock, instant speed removal, cleans up cheap creatures, right? If your opponent plays maybe a 1-drop and a 2-drop, before you're able to get Essence Scatter online, the Shock and Lightning Strike are going to clean them up real nice. And the fact that they're an instant, they play into your counterspell game plan. So you can leave up mana for a counterspell. If you decide not to use the counterspell, you can instead use your mana that turn for Shock or Lightning Strike. Great removal. They don't go to the face very often. You're not going to target your opponent, especially because this deck doesn't attack very well. But sometimes you might. The deck is able to kind of close out games. So sometimes these are going to go to the face. Most times they're going to be going to creatures. Great removal spells. Speaking of removal spells, the last removal spell here is kind of our catch-all removal spell. Enchant creature. When Unquenchable Thirst enters the battlefield, if you control a desert or there is a desert in your graveyard, tap enchanted creature. We're playing 8 deserts. We'll talk about that in just a second. But enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. So Unquenchable Thirst, if you don't have a desert in play or in your graveyard, you can put this on a creature that's already tapped and it won't untap anymore. Any creature, no matter how big it is, no matter how fat it is, as long as it doesn't have hexproof and it's tapped, you put this on it, it's not going to attack you anymore. If you do have a desert, you can put it on an untapped creature and it's not going to attack you anymore. So for only 2 mana, being able to basically answer any creature, this is a very powerful effect. This is big incentive for us to play a bunch of deserts, which we kind of want to do anyway for a couple other reasons, which we're going to get to. But 2 mana, it is at sorcery speed, you have to play it on your turn, but since it only costs 2, by turn 4 you can play this and leave up Essence Scatter. By turn 5 you can play this and leave up Cancel, right? So the fact that it's cheap and it answers any creature threat, just about any creature threat, definitely a great removal spell to have in a control deck. Alright, moving down, we've got 2 creatures here. Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs was definitely in our blue-black desert control deck. It's a 2 mana 0/4 defender. It blocks lots of creatures. And you can tap Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs to deal 1 damage to target player, but you can activate this ability only if you control a desert or there is a desert in your graveyard, right? So similar to Unquenchable Thirst, it rewards you for having deserts. So this guy, he's going to sit around, he's going to block, he's going to soak up some damage, right? If your opponent has a 2/2 in play and you have Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, you don't have to use your shock on their 2/2, you can just block it with Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, so you can save your shock, right? Oftentimes that leaves you in a better position because remember, in the game of Magic, the player who plays their instance last or second usually has an advantage. So let me paint a picture for you. Your opponent has a 2/2. You have Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs and 1 mana open, okay, and shock in your hand. You don't want to shock their 2/2 because you know you can block it with Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs. They attack you with their 2/2. You block with Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs. They use a pump spell on their 2/2 to make it a 4/4, right? There's lots of spells that give target creature +2/+2. That means that it's going to kill Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs. But because they played their instant first, before their instant resolves, targeting their creature that's in combat with your wall, it's still a 2/2 while their spell is on the stack. So you have a window to play Shock and kill their creature and essentially get a 2-for-1. You're spending one card, and which is Shock, to kill their creature, which is one card, and you're getting their Pump spell, which is going to fizzle because their creature died before it could resolve. So you're spending your Shock to get their creature and their Pump spell. And that is made possible because of Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, right? Having blockers, especially cheap, high toughness blockers, is very good for control decks. And then being the fact that this cheap, high toughness blocker can also coincidentally win you the game, albeit over many, many turns, that's just gravy, right? So excuse me. So Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, very strong Magic card, especially when you have deserts in play. Okay. And I guess I'll make a comment here. There are other defenders or 0 toughness or 0 power creatures that make good blockers, but in the game of Magic, you want to make sure that your cards are always going to be useful, right? So for example, if your opponent has no creatures in play and you were to draw Consulate Skygate, it's a 2-mana 0/4 defender with reach, right? It's a great blocker, but if you're looking at a board and your opponent has no creatures and you draw Consulate Skygate, it's not going to do anything, right? It's just going to sit there and be able to block the creatures that aren't even in play. So playing strictly defensive cards is... You don't want to play too many of them, right? We're already playing a bunch of strictly defensive cards, right? Essence, Scatter, Cancel, Unquenchable Thirst, Lightning Strike, Shock, right? So we don't want our creatures to be strictly defensive, which is why Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, the tap ability to be able to deal 1 damage to an opponent, you're going to at least be progressing your game plan closer to killing them. You're unlikely to kill them with just Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, although you can do it, just 20 turns. But being able to play it and start pressuring your opponent makes it better than most other 0-powered creatures. Very rarely do 0-powered creatures see play in Constructed, but this is one exception. All right, the last comment about Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, because it's a tap ability, this is a mistake I see lots of new players making. They kind of assume that they have to tap their creatures to block, right? They'll announce their blockers and then tap their creatures. And I can see how someone would make that mistake. You don't have to tap your creatures to block. They just have to be untapped in order to block. So if Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs is untapped, you can block their creature, and then after combat on your opponent's turn, you can still tap, assuming Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs is still alive, you can still tap Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs to deal 1 damage to your opponent. Okay? So it can block and then still ping at the same time. It'll serve both functions at the same time. So just a all-around good card. Very solid. Excuse me. Alright, the last card in the deck. This is the card I'm least sure about. It's definitely a very powerful card, Firebrand Archer. 2 mana, 2/1. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. We've seen this card featured in a lot of aggro decks. But... Oh, no, I think there's a dash. So we've seen this card featured in a lot of aggro decks, right? A 2 mana, 2/1, it's pretty good at attacking. The ability is very, very relevant for killing your opponent quickly, which is what aggro decks want to do. But we're not an aggro deck, right? This is a control deck, it's not an aggro deck. So Firebrand Archer in this deck, it doesn't block very well, which is what control decks want to do. It attacks decently, which control decks might find themselves doing, maybe once they kill or answer all of their opponent's creatures. But it's included in the deck because we have so many spells, right? There are... What is this? 24 spells in the deck that'll trigger Firebrand Archer. So that's a lot. And each spell dealing 1 damage to your opponent, you're kind of chipping away damage, just like Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs. But Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs can block and chip away damage, where Firebrand Archer doesn't make as good of a blocker, because if it blocks something, it's likely going to die, because it has 1 toughness. So the ability is fine in this deck. It's not the greatest, because 1 damage doesn't always matter. Remember, in the game of Magic, the most important point of life is the last one, so Even if you trigger this guy 3 times, if you're getting overrun by your opponent, that doesn't matter. You're going to die before they are. So Firebrand Archer, it might be good in this deck. I haven't played this deck at all yet. Mike has played this deck and he likes Firebrand Archer. One thing, if you do want to try this deck out, if you don't like Firebrand Archer that much, you may consider trying Nimbleblade Kenra. It can attack when the board is clear, similar to Firebrand Archer. And in those situations, you can turn your extra spells into extra damage with Nimbleblade Kenra. But Nimbleblade Kenra is a much better blocker than Firebrand Archer, right? You can play it on turn 2. It's a 1/3 blocker, so it'll block most 2/2s. All the 2/1s can't attack into it. And then if your opponent attacks into it in the middle of combat, and then you cast a Hieroglyphic Illumination or an Opt or even a Lightning Strike or a Shock in the middle of combat, then it'll grow, become a better blocker. It'll start killing their attackers as they're attacking into you. So Nimbleblade Kenra might be better than Firebrand Archer. I'm not sure. I know that when Mike built the deck, he kind of built it around Firebrand Archer. But since it's a control deck, I'm a little hesitant about how good Firebrand Archer is going to be. But, only way to find that out is to play test. I am hoping to start making some more, what do you call them? I'm having a brain fart right now. Some more gameplay videos, there we go, starting next week. I did just move houses, so my life is in a little bit of upheaval right now, and finding time to coordinate having an opponent to record a video takes a little extra time that I'm not able to put towards this right now. But hopefully next week my house and my life will settle down a little bit and we'll see some more gameplay videos. I guess I'll talk about the mana base here. So yeah, gameplay videos. If you give this deck if you take this deck for a spin, let me know what you think of Firebrand Archer or just the deck in general, and then I'll try to make some gameplay videos, and then we'll see what we think of Firebrand Archer. Moving on to the mana base, we're playing 24 lands. It's a control deck. We have a 7-cost spell in our deck. We want to not miss land drops, so we're playing 24 lands. And in order to protect us against Mana Flood, we're playing 4 Cycle Deserts, right? If you have too many lands, you can spend 2 mana, discard this from your hand to draw a new card. If you draw too many lands, you're going to be very happy to have these Cycle Deserts in your hand. And the cards that check for deserts, Unquenchable Thirst and Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, the desert can be in play to turn on their extra abilities, or it can be in your graveyard, right? So when you cycle them, you can still get the bonus of having the deserts in your deck. They do come into play tapped, so they do slow us down a little bit, but this deck is kind of sacrificing a little bit in the early game to have a really strong mid to late game. And there's enough cheap removal in the deck, right? Like Shock, Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs isn't removal, but it's a blocker, so it's kind of removal. Unquenchable Thirst, right? There's enough cheap spells in the deck that if we have a slow start with some tap lands, we can make up for it later in the game. Your life total is a resource when you're playing control decks, right? You can't be afraid of taking some damage in the early game and then kind of stabilizing at maybe 5 or 6 life, even 1 life, right? In Magic, the most important point of life is the last one. You can still play the game as long as you have 1 life. So yeah, use your life total as a resource. You might have a slower start, but you're gonna take this deck is built to take over in the mid to late game. The deck is playing 4 Highland Lakes. Highland Lake enters the battlefield tapped. It can make either blue or red mana, so it fixes the mana of the deck a little bit. Having 12 come into play tapped lands might be too many. The deck is designed to kind of have a slow start, but if it's way too slow, then you might run into some trouble, especially if you need to be leaving up Cancel or you want to cast Hieroglyphic Illumination on turn 4 and your land comes into play tapped. You're not going to have a great day in those situations. So Highland Lake might get cut for just more basics. Again, I'm not sure. I haven't played the deck yet. But that's the main deck. As I said, it's very similar to the blue-black control deck, just playing some red removal spells instead of black, and then we get Firebrand Archer, and some sideboard slots. So, here in the sideboard, I think the biggest addition that red offers control is Shatter. Blue-black control has a really hard time answering Inventor's Goggles. and Inventor's Goggles, especially on Bastion Inventor. We've seen Inventor's Goggle Bastion Inventor decks take down the last 2 tournaments with Blue-Red Improvise and Blue-Green Auras. So having a way to kill Inventor's Goggles that's cheap. Black and blue don't have any ways to do that. Red has Shatter. So Shatter is a big pickup for control, especially in the way that the current metagame is shaping up. So we get Shatter. Magma Spray is in here if your opponent is playing a bunch of good targets, right? If you want more copies of Shock, you can play Magma Spray. Or if your opponent is playing Sacred Cat or Unwavering Initiate, that both have Embalm abilities that can be activated from the graveyard, Magma Spray will kill those creatures and then exile them so that your opponent doesn't get the Embalm effect, right? So Magma Spray, kind of extra shocks that are incidentally good against 2 of the stronger white cards. Dual Shot, if your opponent has a bunch of 1 toughness creatures in play or in their deck, you can sign in some number of Dual Shots. Soul of the Rapids is very good against other control decks, just decks where you want to have more threats, especially hexproof threats, right? If you're playing against a deck that has a ton of removal, they're probably going to kill your Firebrand Archers and Walls, and you only have 4 Striped Riverwinders in the deck. If you want more win conditions with hexproof, Soul of the Rapids is a very good one. Negate, again, in the control mirror, fighting over counterspells is very important. Being able to counter their cancel or being able to protect your hexproof creature from an essence scatter is very, very relevant. So Negate comes in to fight against the decks that have a ton of removal as well, or especially counterspells. Last 2 cards in the sideboard are Consulate Skygate. As I said, having a strictly defensive card is not always the greatest, but sometimes if your opponent's deck is really fast, that you just need to make some sacrifices in that regard. So Consulate Skygate in here just in case you play against some very aggressive decks. So that is Blue-Red Control. I hope that you enjoyed this deck. As I said in the beginning of the video, Control is my favorite archetype to play. And I just really, really like the feeling of drawing cards and having more cards than my opponent, right? The more cards you have, the more options you have. The more options you have, the higher likelihood it is that you'll be able to maneuver yourself into a win. All right, so thank you for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit that like button if you like our content. Hit that subscribe button if you want to get continual updates on Standard Pauper. And if you appreciate what we do here at MTG808 Junior, please consider becoming a Patreon subscriber. For as little as $1 a month, you can support Youth Magic on Oahu. Our Youth Scholarship Tournament is solely funded by our Patreon money. So thank you to our patrons out there. And if you want to support what we do, please consider becoming a patron. If you donate at least $1, you'll get access to our monthly expenditure report. You'll see how we spend our money. And then if you do $10 or more, you'll get your name listed as a contributor on one of the beautiful plaques that we have posted in our partner local game stores. So thank you for stopping by. Let us know what you think about Blue-Red Control, and hope to catch you next time. Ciao.